Part 3. Chapter 1. On the evening of New Year's Day, grandfather was walking to and fro, across the carpet, listening to the rain which beat hard against the curtained windows. The riotous blast shook the casement, as if a strong man were striving to force his entrance into the comfortable room. With every puff of the wind, the fire leapt upward from the hearth, laughing and rejoicing at the shrieks of the wintry storm. Meanwhile, grandfather's chair stood in its customary place by the fireside. The bright blaze gleamed upon the fantastic figures of its oaken back, and shone through the open work, so that a complete pattern was thrown upon the opposite side of the room. Sometimes, for a moment or two, the shadow remained immovable, as if it were painted on the wall. Then, all at once, it began to quiver, and leap, and dance, with a frisky motion. Anon, seeming to remember that these antics were unworthy of such a dignified and venerable chair, it suddenly stood still. But soon it began to dance anew. "Only see how grandfather's chair is dancing," cried little Alice. And she ran to the wall, and tried to catch hold of the flickering shadow, for to children of 5 years old, a shadow seems almost as real as a substance. "I wish," said Clara, "grandfather would sit down in the chair, and finish its history." If the children had been looking at grandfather, they would have noticed that he paused in his walk across the room, when Clara made this remark. The kind old gentleman was ready and willing to resume his stories of departed times. But he had resolved to wait till his auditors should request him to proceed, in order that they might find the instructive history of the chair a pleasure, and not a task. "Grandfather," said Charlie, "I am tired to death of this dismal rain, and of hearing the wind roar in the chimney. I have had no good time all day. It would be better to hear stories about the chair, than to sit doing nothing, and thinking of nothing." To say the truth, our friend Charlie was very much out of humour with the storm, because it had kept him all day within doors, and hindered him from making trial of a splendid sled, which grandfather had given him for a New Year's gift. As all sleds, nowadays, must have a name, the one in question had been honoured with the title of Grandfather's Chair, which was painted in golden letters, on each of the sides. Charlie greatly admired the construction of the new vehicle, and felt certain that it would outstrip any other sled that ever dashed down the long slopes of the common. As for Lawrence, he happened to be thinking, just at this moment, about the history of the chair. Kind old grandfather had made him a present of a volume of engraved portraits, representing the features of eminent and famous people of all countries. Among them Lawrence found several who had formerly occupied our chair, or been connected with its adventures. While grandfather walked to and fro across the room, the imaginative boy was gazing at the historic chair. He endeavored to summon up the portraits which he had seen in his volume, and to place them, like living figures, in the empty seat. "The old chair has begun another year of its existence, today," said Lawrence. "We must make haste, or it will have a new history to be told before we finish the old one." "Yes, my children," replied grandfather, with a smile and a sigh, "another year has been added to those of the 2 centuries, and upward, which have passed since the Lady Arbella brought this chair over from England. It is 3 times as old as your grandfather, but a year makes no impression on its oaken frame, while it bends the old man nearer and nearer to the earth, so let me go on with my stories while I may." Accordingly, grandfather came to the fireside, and seated himself in the venerable chair. The lion's head looked down with a grimly good-natured aspect, as the children clustered around the old gentleman's knees. It almost seemed as if a real lion were peeping over the back of the chair, and smiling at the group of auditors, with a sort of lion-like complacence. Little Alice, whose fancy often inspired her with singular ideas, exclaimed that the lion's head was nodding at her, and that it looked as if it were going to open its wide jaws and tell a story. But, as the lion's head appeared to be in no haste to speak, and as there was no record or tradition of its having spoken, during the whole existence of the chair, grandfather did not consider it worth while to wait. Chapter 2. "Charlie, my boy," said grandfather, "do you remember who was the last occupant of the chair?" "It was Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson," answered Charlie. "Sir Francis Bernard, the new governor, had given him the chair, instead of putting it away in the garret of the province house. And when we took leave of Hutchinson, he was sitting by his fireside, and thinking of the past adventures of the chair, and of what was to come." "Very well," said grandfather, "and you recollect that this was in 1763, or thereabouts, at the close of the old French War. Now, that you may fully comprehend the remaining adventures of the chair, I must make some brief remarks on the situation and character of the New England colonies at this period." So grandfather spoke of the earnest loyalty of our fathers during the old French War, and after the conquest of Canada had brought that war to a triumphant close. The people loved and reverenced the King of England, even more than if the ocean had not rolled its waves between him and them, for, at the distance of 3,000 miles, they could not discover his bad qualities and imperfections. Their love was increased by the dangers which they had encountered in order to heighten his glory and extend his dominion. Throughout the war, the American colonists had fought side by side with the soldiers of Old England, and nearly 30,000 young men had laid down their lives for the honor of King George. And the survivors loved him the better, because they had done and suffered so much for his sake. But, there were some circumstances, that caused America to feel more independent of England than at an earlier period. Canada and Acadia had now become British provinces, and our fathers were no longer afraid of the bands of French and Indians, who used to assault them in old times. For a century and a half this had been the great terror of New England. Now, the old French soldier was driven from the north forever. And, even had it been otherwise, the English colonies were growing so populous and powerful, that they might have felt fully able to protect themselves without any help from England. There were thoughtful and sagacious men, who began to doubt, whether a great country like America, would always be content to remain under the government of an island 3,000 miles away. This was the more doubtful, because the English Parliament had long ago made laws which were intended to be very beneficial to England, at the expense of America.